Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we are here to do an April reading wrap up. And let me tell you, I'm so excited. My reading in April was spectacular. There were a handful of not so great books, but for the most part, my reading was solid to excellent and I have a lot to recommend. So let's go ahead and jump into some quick statistics and then I will get into the reviews of each of the books. In total, I read 25 books in the month of April. That's pretty good. I felt like I was flying through them just because I was trying to get through so many of the books for the Women's Prize. For total pages, I read 8,306 pages. That averages to 338 pages per book. My top 5 genres for the month were literary fiction, memoir, historical fiction, contemporary fiction, and fantasy. My shortest read was Treacle Walker at 160 pages. My longest read was The Bone Clocks at 624 pages. In terms of how my page count broke down, 36% of my reads were under 300 pages, 56% of my reads were between 300 and 500 pages, and only 8% of my reads this month were over 500 pages. For a fiction to nonfiction ratio, 20% of my reading this month was nonfiction and 80% of my reading this month was fictional. That means that I read 5 nonfiction books this month, which I am so thrilled with. I have done really well with reading more nonfiction this year, which was one of my main goals for 2024. I did especially well in the beginning of the year because I was reading for the first round of the Booktube Prize and I was in the nonfiction round. So that introduced me to several works of nonfiction that I had not previously read. And so I was a little nervous that in other months that my nonfiction count was going to dip a bit, but I've actually been really consistent and I am super pleased with that. So now we're going to go ahead and get into the reviews of the books. We're going to start with my 2-star reads. A 2-star for me means that I would not recommend this book. There was something major that did not work for me in the writing, the plot, the characters, usually a combination of elements that just for whatever reason didn't vibe with me. It doesn't mean that you won't necessarily like them, but definitely a no for me. So the first of my 2-star reads is kind of a bummer, and that's The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell. So me and Jaimee Kate buddy read this and we both have had it sitting on our shelves for a very long time. And we decided that a buddy read would be the right thing to motivate us to finally clear it off of our shelves. Unfortunately, neither of us ended up liking this book very much. We both finished it. Jaimee said that it was a bummer that this was my first time reading David Mitchell because she's read his other books and enjoyed them while she really did not enjoy this one. I found this one to be kind of dry, all over the place. It has some science fiction elements, but it's kind of like a whole series of vignettes or short stories that make a collective whole story. And I found some of the POVs that it goes into like tedious and unnecessary. They didn't really contribute much to the story. And then the part of the story that I was interested in, I wish it got more time than it did. This was just all over the place. It was, not my favorite read for sure. My second 2-star read is one that I'm really bummed to put on this list as well, and that is The Morningside by Téa Obreht. So this was my first time reading Téa Obreht, although I do have her book Inland on my shelves. This one sounded pretty interesting to me. We have a mother and a daughter who are fleeing a situation. They're living in this community called the Morningside. Their aunt works there and she gives them refuge. And the Morningside is kind of like a crumbling old apartment building. There's some mysterious things going on, but they're making do with what they have. What it kind of turns out to be is that they're fleeing from like a genocide. I want to say that this was representative of like Bosnia and Herzegovina, but it was just so all over the place. The problem is we don't get to that part of the story until like halfway through or later in the book. And there's all this like really convoluted, nonsensical stuff that happens prior. And it's only really my dedication to trying to give a book a fair shot and not DNFing a lot that got me through this, because honestly there were several points that I considered DNFing it and I kept waiting for it to turn around. There was like a subplot about scuba diving, which I'm a big scuba diver, so I thought I'd be really interested in. Wasn't very exciting. There was a subplot about some mysterious neighbors in the apartment building. Nothing really comes of that. Like there's a lot of red herrings, but done in strange ways. This just, if it had been trimmed down to like 150 pages and focused on the genocide aspect of things, I think it might have been a much more interesting book. Unfortunately, this one just did not work for me. Now we're gonna get into my 3-star reads. And for me, a 3-star means the book was okay. I wouldn't not recommend it, but I also am not raving about it. Usually there's at least one major flaw for me. So the first book that I'm gonna talk about in my 3-star category is one that I feel like a lot of people are gonna be shocked to hear, and that's The Wren by Enright. This is a book that just got shortlisted for the Women's Prize. A lot of people seem to love it and are raving about it. For me, it just felt really boring. It is about a family dealing with the reputation of this famous poet grandfather who just disappeared and abandoned the family. We have two different perspectives. We have mom, who is bitter after being abandoned by her father, and then we have granddaughter who idolizes her author grandfather and really looks up to him. There were parts of this that I liked, but overall I just felt bored with this book. This is a narrative that I feel like I've seen done before. I did really admire the fact that Enright wrote the poems and like little snippets in the book herself. I think that's pretty impressive, but unfortunately it wasn't enough to make this book a 4-star for me. Then I read Heart Song by TJ Klune. This is the third book in the Wolf Song series, and this was enjoyable enough. This is another one of those books where if you've read the first 2 books in the series and you like them, you will probably like book 3 just fine. Personally, I'm starting to find this series gets a little bit tedious by the time that we get to book 3. It's kind of the same cycle over and over and over again. There is some very angsty relationship drama, there's some wolf fights, there's some magic, but it's kind of just the same story repeated. Then I had The Perfect Nanny by Leila Slimani. So this is about a French-Moroccan family, and they hire a babysitter to watch their younger children as mom is returning back to work as a high-powered attorney. The nanny that they hire initially seems perfect in every way. She anticipates the family's needs. She takes over the cooking, the cleaning, she organizes the house. The kids love her. She is a dream come true. But then we find out that there is a darker side to this nanny and things start to get called into question. This is a pretty short book. I want to say it is 230 pages, moves pretty quickly, and I actually found the first half of this to be really engrossing. I was actually really invested in the story and read it really quickly, and then I got to the end and I was just massively disappointed. This is one of those books that has kind of a cop-out of an ending. Everything fades to black, it's left vague, and it's up to the reader to interpret. And sometimes that works, but I feel like with thrillers, that is kind of a cop-out. Like, you've written an interesting thriller and then you don't tie up the end pieces. For me, I just wasn't happy with how this finished. Next up in my 3-star list was Treacle Walker by Alan Garner. This is a book that I became aware of around Booker season last year. I believe it was longlisted but not shortlisted. And I want to say that this one was kind of one of those controversial picks. A lot of people were not that excited about it. And I kind of get it. It's an okay fable, but nothing really spectacular. It's a very short read at 160 pages. I just barely got to know the characters and what was going on before the story was ending. And it didn't really do anything that was extremely moving or touching or really like made me think about anything in a different way. I don't really get all of the acclaim for this book. And then I read No One Prayed Over Their Graves by Khalid Khalifa. This is a book about Syria, but not about modern Syria with the war and all of that going on. This is about a small town. There are 2 men. They go out for a night of revelry and partying, and while they are away, their town is hit with a massive flood. It knocks down all the buildings, it kills everybody that lives in this town, and these 2 men are the only survivors of this flood. They go into deep stages of grief, and then it is about their lives after the flood. So this in theory sounds fantastic. This is like a story idea that I hadn't really heard of before, not something I've seen done over and over again. Unfortunately, it ends up not being very exciting. While I wouldn't say that the writing is bad, I will say it's very slow paced and extremely character focused. I don't feel like a whole lot happened. I wanted the flood to be much more prominent in the story. I wanted there to be like a lot more happening, you know, coming across the wreckages of this town, finding out everybody's dead, this just extreme grief. And instead it goes in a significantly different direction. The flood seems like it's kind of a minor point in the story. And then we spend a lot of time with this one character's internal thought. For me, this was okay. I think other people might get more out of it than I did, but for me, I wanted a lot more from this book. And then I have The Singularity by Balsam Karam. This is a book about a refugee. We have a woman who is in a refugee camp. We don't know where she's from. We don't know where the refugee camp is located, but we know that she is wandering around the refugee camp looking for her daughter. She becomes extremely distraught when she is unable to find her daughter, and then she ends up flinging herself from the cliffside in distress. Another mother witnesses this, and that affects the outcome of that mother's life. This is a very tight look at grief. And it doesn't just look at the person experiencing the grief, but the way that that grief affects the people surrounding them. I thought that that part was really interesting. I thought that this book did a lot of good things. I think overall, I again wanted a little more from this book. I wish it went just a little bit deeper. But I did like that this was a nameless place. I like that we can kind of guess where it might be taking place, but honestly, this could fit a variety of different conflicts around the world. This is the first book by Karam that has been translated into English. I believe that they normally write in Swedish, although it could be wrong about that. I did think that this was a good translation, and overall, I think a lot of people will like this book or get something out of it. For me, it was very close to being a 4 stars, but there was just a few elements that kind of kept it from being that full 4 stars for me. And speaking of 4 stars, we're now going to get into those 4-star reads. First up, we're going to talk about And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. This is one of the books that I was reading for the Women's Prize, and it was one of the books that I really hoped was going to make it onto the shortlist. Unfortunately, it did not. We have a Indigenous woman from Canada. She is of Mohawk origin, and she's married to a white guy. They've moved to the suburbs. She's expecting her first child, and there are just a lot of things going on. She's feeling isolated in her new community. She's the only Indigenous person there. She feels like the neighbors are judging her, looking for reasons to hate her. She's having some postpartum issues, and she's trying to express all of this to her husband. Initially, he seems supportive, but then you realize that he's actually quite dismissive of what she's saying, and supportive kind of in words only and not so much in actions. This book starts to take some terrifying turns, and you feel like this is going to go into a horror direction. And then this takes a left turn and goes in a direction that honestly, if I paid you $5 million to figure it out, you would never, ever, ever guess what the author was going to do. The left turn that it makes, I don't know if everyone is going to like it. Like for some people, it's going to be too weird and just too strange, and it's going to throw off the book for them. And for some people, they're going to find like the humor in it and the interest in it and where the author was going. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle of those two. I did feel like this was a completely separate book towards the end, but by the time that I finished reading all of it, I kind of understood where the author was going with it and what she was trying to say. I don't know if it works 100% for me, but I think the fact that I could understand the messaging around it helped it work better for me. I think this is not going to be a book for every single person, but I do think that the people that like it are going to really get something out of it. And then I read 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster by Mirinae Lee. This was also for the Women's Prize. This is a book that I'm really glad was on the long list, and it was another book that I would have been okay with seeing on the short list. It wasn't the top 6 books that I predicted for the short list, but it was an alternate pick. And again, this one didn't get picked either. This is about a woman named Mrs. Mook, and she is telling the story of her life in 8 parts. It is non-linear, so she starts kind of in the middle of her life and then goes forward and backward through time. What a life she's lived. She's almost 100 years old, and she has lived through quite a bit. She lived through the Japanese occupation of Korea. She lived through the American invasion of Korea, the splitting up of North and South Korea. She was a spy, a mother, all sorts of different things. And this book is really, really interesting. The first half of this book is where it really, really excels. It's when she's talking about the Japanese occupation and then the American occupation and then the division between North and South Korea and living in North Korea as it becomes a totalitarian dictatorship. I thought that that's where this story really shined, in those 3 parts. I think some of the other aspects of the story where she's talking about being a spy and being a mom, for me, the story kind of started to slow down and just feel a little bit uneven in those parts. It's not that they were completely uninteresting, but just I felt like that they dragged a little bit, whereas some of the more interesting parts in the beginning felt almost a bit rushed. There is so much packed into this book. It is not a crazy long book. It sounds like it should be like 700 pages, but it's not. It's a fast read. It's really engaging. And there's some mystery elements that kind of really keep you engrossed in the story, trying to figure out who this woman is and what is going on. I would say that the only reason this didn't end up being a 5-star and one of my favorite books on this list was because of that uneven pacing. Like I said, some parts of the book were so fast, and then some parts felt like they really dragged. Overall, I think this was a really good read, and I would definitely read books by Mirinae Lee again. And then I had Mecca by Susan Straight. I buddy read this with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics, and I picked this for him because he had asked me to pick out a modern piece of fiction. He typically likes classics and doesn't read a whole lot of like modern contemporary stuff. So we've been talking about it for a couple months, and I've been trying to think of a book that I thought that Alan might enjoy. And I had been recommended Mecca at a bookstore, I want to say around Christmas time. And this is like set in the Southwest. We have a gentleman who is a police officer. He is dealing with all sorts of different things. He has this potential murder situation that he dealt with. He's dealing with racism. He's dealing with this conflict between identity and his job. There is just so much going on. And it just sounded like a book that I thought that Alan might really enjoy. So we both read this, and I think we both read it pretty quickly. I remember us touching base like right as we were each starting it and kind of finishing within a couple days. This is packed with themes, and this is also a lot different than I expected. I thought I was just gonna focus on our main character, Johnny Frias, who is a police officer, but it actually focuses on a whole cast of different characters, and all of them are really interesting and really engaging. This story covers a lot of territory, but I thought it was handled really well. This was my first time reading Susan Straight, and I would definitely pick up a book by her again. I'm really curious to see if Alan liked it as much as I did. Based on our conversation, I think he had a good time with it, but I'm not sure if this was like a 3-star, 4-star, 5-star. So I'll be curious to see what he says when he reviews it. My next 4-star read was Alebrijes by Donna Barba Higuera. So I read The Last Cuentista by Donna Barba Higuera last year, and that was, I think, my favorite middle grade book of the year. Now, I don't read a whole ton of middle grade. Typically, I actually only read middle grade during middle grade March. And I had requested Alebrijes for middle grade March, and unfortunately the waitlist was too long, and so I didn't end up getting it until April. But I decided to go ahead and read it anyways because I enjoyed The Last Cuentista so much. Alebrijes probably wasn't as deep as The Last Cuentista was, but it's in the same world, and the stories kind of tie together nicely with a few Easter eggs. We have a brother and his sister. They're living in this like dystopian civilization, and there is extreme competition for resources. And furthermore, if you break rules within this society, you're sent out into the field where there are these large carnivorous worms that kill anyone sent out in that direction. When the brother breaks some rules, because he's underage, he's given a special punishment. That special punishment is to have his consciousness transferred into a little figurine called an alebrije, where he will do a couple years worth of time before he is released at the age of 18 to become a productive member of society. While he is in the form of an alebrije, he faces a conundrum and he has to decide what to do and what to risk. This was a pretty engaging book. I enjoyed it. I read it really, really quickly. But the thing that I think I like the most about Barba Higuera is that while she's writing for a middle grade audience, her books do not feel juvenile or immature. I definitely say that her books are on the higher end of the middle grade spectrum, and I would say that they probably could even be enjoyed by an older audience. This was good fun. I love again, the Easter eggs for The Last Cuentista. I like the worlds that she's created, and I love the way that she mixes in Mexican culture with her stories. It's like this futuristic Mexican culture that's kind of evolved from what Mexican culture is in modern society. I think that is fantastically done, and I would definitely read more books by Barba Higuera in the future. And then I had When We Were Sisters by Fatima Asghar. So this is a book about 3 sisters. Their parents have died, and the 3 sisters are basically left to care for one another. The baby sister is struggling with her gender identity and figuring out who she is. The middle sister is struggling not to fight with her younger sister, and the eldest sister has become the new mom in this little family. This is an interesting book. It's very poetic. It moves between different POVs. We definitely get a good feel for who the different sisters are and how they're trying to get through life. It wasn't the easiest book to read. There are definitely some really brutal parts of this book, but overall I thought that this was really well done. I did occasionally find it a little confusing moving between the different POVs, but for the most part I thought it was really well written. And if you're looking for trans authors to read during Pride Month in June or any other time of the year, Fatima Asghar is trans. Then I have Ordinary Girls by Jaquira Diaz. So this is Diaz's memoir of her life growing up, and it's not the easiest life. Initially, her parents are together, and that seems to be when her life is the most stable, but then her parents split up, and her dad basically leaves her to be raised by her mother. There's just one problem. Her mother's schizophrenic and is completely out of control. She has a drug addiction, and she isn't stable enough to take care of herself, let alone her 2 daughters. Unfortunately, due to her mother's erratic behavior and the instability that she's faced with, Diaz ends up making some not so great choices in life. She turns it around eventually, and this memoir basically explores that, how she got into trouble and how she got out of it. This is emotional and really well written. I think the only thing that I wanted from this that I didn't get is I wanted a little bit more of what happened to Diaz after she kind of grew up and got a little bit more stable. But overall, I thought this was really well written and it was an interesting look into her life. Then I had The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. So the main character of this story is a high school aged boy who is autistic, and he is getting ready to take his A-levels. A lot of people aren't taking him very seriously, like his school, his teachers, they're saying that they don't think there's any point to him taking his A-levels, but he feels confident that he can pass them and do exceedingly well, and he eventually talks them into this. He's dealing with the grief of his mother's death, and him and his father are trying to find a routine and a way in life after loss. Then this young man comes across his neighbor's dog, and his neighbor's dog has been murdered. He's been stabbed with a garden tool, and of course our main character decides to try to figure out who killed this dog. Initially, he's actually blamed for the death of the dog because he's seen at the scene of the crime, but he begins combing the neighborhood, asking the neighbors questions. And I think the thing that's really unique about this story is because our main character is autistic, we're seeing everything through his eyes, and we see how much he feels uncomfortable with like new social interaction. He's trying to communicate with his neurotypical neighbors, and you can see his anxiety. He frequently misses social cues or misunderstands what they're saying, or he says things in very direct ways that they don't necessarily understand either. This mystery of the dog leads him into a couple other mysteries as well, and this ends up being a fairly emotional read. At first, I thought this was going to be kind of a cutesy, fun book, but it goes some pretty deep places. And I really, again, like that this main character is autistic and that we're seeing this whole story through his eyes. We really get a sense of what it might be like to see the world through neurodivergent eyes. My only qualm with this book is that there were a couple places where I felt like the main character was a little bit infantilized. I did think that he was very capable and very intelligent, and there were a couple little conundrums that he ran into where I was like, I don't know if this really fits the character that's been built here, but maybe it was written this way to kind of heighten the suspense. All in all, I think it's an enjoyable read. Then I have Bride of the Sea by Eman Quotah. So this is about two characters. They're originally from Saudi Arabia and now they're living in Cleveland. They're young and they're married and they're expecting their first child. When the marriage starts to go wrong, divorce becomes whispered and the two of them eventually decide to part ways. The husband goes back to Saudi Arabia and the wife disappears into the United States to never be found, along with her daughter. The father spends most of his life looking for his daughter and his ex-wife. He wants a relationship with his child and he cannot rest until he finds out what happens to them. So this book was pretty well written. I really liked that this book features a setting in Saudi Arabia and a setting in the United States. There's a lot of compare and contrast between the two cultures. I don't know if I've actually ever read a book set in Saudi Arabia before either, so this was really interesting for me. I think the thing that this book does the most successfully is that the daughter, who has grown up in the United States, is eventually reintroduced to Saudi Arabian culture and goes back to Saudi Arabia to visit her family. And we get to see what it's like to see Saudi Arabia through the eyes of somebody who's from that culture, but not necessarily of that culture. She's been raised as an American and she has a very American view of things. And so her perception of Saudi Arabia and what life is like when she finally gets there is so interesting. I thought that that was really a fascinating part of the book. I almost wish that this delved a little bit deeper into that. It also delved into some of the politics of Saudi Arabia and the United States, which I thought was really interesting as well. All in all, I think this was really well written, and I think that if you're particularly interested in Saudi Arabia, this would be a good book to read. And then I read The Measure by Nikki Erlich. So I found this at Christmas time in a little free library, and I was so excited because I've been hearing nothing but good things about this book. I have seen people talking about this book. Even people that I expect to not really enjoy this book as much seem to really like it. Everybody seems pleasantly surprised with the ending. So I was excited to give it a try for myself. I found the story pretty compelling. I can't talk a whole lot about it without giving away spoilers, but I can say basically that one day, everybody wakes up with a box at their house that has a string in it, and the length of the string determines how much life you have left. The longer the string, the longer you're gonna live. The shorter the string, the quicker you're gonna die. This causes a whole bunch of chaos all around the world. This focuses on quite a few different characters, and they're all dealing with this revelation of the string in different ways. I thought that that was really true to life. Each character has their own feelings around the situation, their own thoughts on what it means. They interpret it in different ways. And I thought that that was really well done. As for the conclusion of this story, I found it pretty interesting. It definitely went in a direction that I didn't expect. I wish that there had been more of a conclusion to the story in some ways, because I think there are some parts of the story that get kind of left open-ended. We don't necessarily get an explanation of everything that's happening. But I did think that the way the author handled it was thought-provoking and thoughtfully done. I don't know that this was a 5-star for me because I didn't find it extremely shocking, but it was a pleasant read. And if you like kind of these scenarios where the whole world is presented with a conundrum, then you might enjoy this book. And then the last of my 4-star reads is more like a 4.5 star, and that is A Woman Is No Man by Etaf Rum. So I've previously read Evil Eye by Etaf Rum, which I really, really enjoyed. And so I was excited to pick up A Woman Is No Man. Man, this was a gut punch of a book. So we have a character named Isra, who is 17. She has dreams of going to college, and then she is married off to a very strange man named Adam. And Adam brings her to live with his family, and his mother Farida is a nightmare. Isra is having a really hard time. She's struggling. Farida is so domineering and demanding. Isra can do nothing right. It is infuriating to read this POV. And then we have 18-year-old Dea, who is an orphan. Her mom and dad are both dead, and she's living with her grandmother Farida. And Farida is insistent that Dea must get married. Dea does not want to get married. She wants to go to school. She wants a life of her own. She wants to fall in love someday and then maybe choose to get married. But she doesn't want an arranged marriage. Her grandparents, however, are absolutely insistent. It doesn't matter how upset she is by this betrothal process. Her grandparents are insistent. As a young conservative Muslim girl, it is her duty to get married and have children for the family. This story flashes back and forth between Isra and Dea's timelines, and I wish I could say that this wasn't infuriating at points. I wish I could say that there were parts of the story that offered some levity, but honestly, I just got more and more angry for our two main characters. There's something about Etaf Rum's writing where she just so brilliantly conveys this struggle for women with autonomy and being able to make your own choices. I thought that that was beautiful. There are parts of this story where the most unlikable characters are looking back at their experiences in Palestine and the refugee camps and then immigrating to the United States. And even as much as they infuriate you at points, you feel some empathy for what they've been through. I thought that this was a really well-written book, and the only reason that I didn't give it a 5 stars is because I felt like the ending was just a little too neat and tidy. I really dislike when characters magically change their mind in an instant without us seeing them slowly starting to come to terms with different beliefs throughout the book. And that's kind of the case for a couple of the characters in this book. They make sudden reversals which are completely counter to who they've been built up to be throughout the story. I felt like maybe if the ending had had a little bit more space to be believable, I would have liked it a bit better. But overall, I don't want that to put anyone off from reading this book. I think this was still really well done. And finally, we're gonna get into my 5-star reads. And let me tell you, I had so many 5 stars this month. This was fantastic. I love it when you pick up book after book and they're just like 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars. It brings me so much joy. And so I'm really excited to talk about these books, and hopefully you'll find some things to add to your TBR as well. So first up was Brotherless Night by Vivi Ganeshnathan, and this was another one of the books that I read for the Women's Prize long list. This was one of my favorite books on the long list and one of the books that I predicted to be shortlisted, and I am excited to say it was actually shortlisted. One of the few books on the shortlist that I am happy to see there. This book is about the Sri Lankan Civil War and the Tamil Tigers, both of which are subjects that I knew very little about. Our main character is a young woman who wants to be a doctor, but finds that path increasingly difficult due to the conflict surrounding her. She does make it into the medical profession eventually, and what she sees via her job treating the wounded in the Civil War. In my review of this book for the Women's Prize shortlist prediction, I mentioned that this book has some scenes that will really stick with you. There are some very haunting things within it. In particular, there is this scene where a woman commits a suicide bombing, and you come to find out what motivated her. And while a suicide bombing is not the appropriate response in any situation, you definitely come to empathize with this woman. And that part really, really stuck with me. It was just so heartbreaking. That wasn't the only time that this story broke my heart though. This is a really emotional, deep, dense read, and I definitely think it deserves its spot on the shortlist. If you are wanting to dip your toes into the Women's Prize shortlist, this is where I would start. I think this was a fantastic pick. So next up in my 5-star reads is Kindred by Octavia Butler. So I read Parable of a Sower a while back and I enjoyed it. And I've been meaning to try some of Butler's other books, but you know, there's so many books on the TBR that it kind of just slips off of my radar. Then I saw a review by Kindles and Kicks, which I'm gonna link up here, that talked about why he couldn't rate Kindred by Octavia Butler. It was such a fantastic review, so thoughtfully done, and he really hits on some fantastic points. And that review really convinced me to bump Kindred up on my list. So I went ahead and requested the audiobook from my library, and once I got it, I devoured it like in one sitting. And he is right, this is a fantastic book. Now, his review is gonna be a million times better and more articulate than anything that I'm gonna put forth, but I am also going to try to explain to you why I think that this is a fantastic read. So in Kindred, our main character is a Black woman. She is married to a white man and she's living in modern times. And she starts to have this weird kind of experience where she starts to get dizzy and then she faints. When she wakes up, she's in the 1800s on a plantation. And somehow we come to find out that her soul is attached to this young white boy who is the son of the plantation owner. This is a conundrum for our main character because, again, she's Black and she's from modern times, but now she's in the 1800s on a plantation where slaves are owned and being brutalized, and she has to find a way to kind of fit in or skate under the radar of the plantation owner. This causes her to have to tolerate and do things that are just horrifying. And she keeps being transported back and forth between the present and the past. There are even points where her husband is transported with her, and that is brutal as well because he now has to do everything that he can to try to protect his wife, but he is limited in his power and ability as well. This book was horrifying for me, but I can only imagine how much more horrifying it would be for someone who's Black. This would be, I feel like, the absolute worst nightmare, waking up in a plantation scenario and being faced with the idea of going from being a free person who had rights to being a slave. Octavia Butler handles this extremely difficult topic exceedingly well. The emotions that are packed into this book, the conflicts, the things that our character deals with, it really is a fantastic read. And as I mentioned, Kindles and Kicks' review of this was one of the best that I've seen. So if you're interested in learning more about this book, you should definitely check that out. Next up on my 5-star list is Enter Ghost by Isabella Jaouad. This is a book that I read for the Women's Prize long list and was one of my picks for the shortlist, and I'm pleased to say that it did in fact get shortlisted. We have a main character who is a Palestinian woman, an actress, and is living in the UK. After a nasty breakup, she goes back to Palestine to visit her family, and while she's there, she is roped into putting on a Shakespeare play in Palestine. This sounds like it could be a lighthearted read, but it actually explores a lot of the conflict in Palestine in great depth. This is very emotional, it's deep, it's really thematically heavy, and it's also a book that feels very timely with all of the things that are going on right now in the world. I think that this is a book that might be hard for some people as the pacing can be a little slow at points, but overall I think it's very thought-provoking and very well written. I would definitely recommend it, especially if you're interested in exploring the shortlist for the Women's Prize. And the next 4 books in my 5 stars are all memoirs. I seriously hit the jackpot with memoirs this month. I read one after the other and all 4 of them were fantastic. And the first of my memoirs was Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This memoir tells the story of Chanel's experience. So if you're unfamiliar with this story, Chanel was sexually assaulted on a college campus. She was at a party, her drink was probably spiked, and she was sexually assaulted behind a dumpster. 2 Swedish foreign exchange students caught the person sexually assaulting her in the act, chased him down, and held him until the police showed up. The police witnessed Chanel passed out in this horribly compromised state. They took her to the hospital. She went through a rape kit. She did all of the things right. And this book basically tells the story of waking up from that, what she experiences, and then the extraordinary emotional and psychological cost of the trial afterward. This book is infuriating, depressing, maddening. I don't know if any woman could read this book and not feel just sheer rage. And I think most men would read this book and also feel sheer rage as well. There is so much broken with how our system here in the States deals with sexual violence against women. And this book reiterates that over and over and over again. The thing is, Chanel Miller is such a fantastic writer. She brings things to life in ways that I can't fully articulate. I was so nervous about reading this book because of what it's about and because I knew I was going to feel rage reading it. But I felt rage, and I also felt like positive emotions for Chanel. I felt so proud of her for writing this book, for finding her voice, for finding the strength to fight back against this just jacked up system. I don't know how to express this fully. Like, it wasn't a light read, but it wasn't something that left me feeling just only depressed afterwards either. This was a brilliant memoir, and I think this is maybe one of the best memoirs of like the last 20 or 30 years. I think in this, Miller has not only provided a voice for herself, but she has provided a voice for any woman who has experienced the brutality of the judicial system in relationship to sexual assault. After that, I read Tell Me Everything by Erica Krause. This is another book that focuses on sexual assault. We have Erica, who is working as a private investigator, and she gets hired to investigate a football team. We have a young lady who has been sexually assaulted by multiple members of a football team. And then stories start to come out. There is a trainer that was assaulted by a player. There's another young woman who's assaulted by a couple players. There's story after story after story. And as you read this, you come to realize that the problem is systemic. It comes from the coach and the trainers all the way down to the recruits. It is appalling and atrocious, but the story is told with a narrative style that makes it really interesting. It's like a mystery, and you're putting it together as Erica is putting it together. And I thought that that made it really compelling. This is a story that I think most people will also be very familiar with. If you were in the States, especially, this particular incident dominated headlines for a good 6 months. But it's really interesting to read it from the investigation's perspective. I thought Erica did a brilliant job of writing this. I think she did a brilliant job in investigating it. And I'm really thankful that she helped to bring to light this culture of sexual violence within the university system here in the States. Another really necessary book. After that, I read Unbound by Tarana Burke. So I read all three of these books back to back to back, and it's a lot of reading about sexual assault. This is another book where I was worried, like after I read the first two, that I was just going to be so bogged down and depressed. But Tarana really is a fantastic writer, and I love that she focused on what the Me Too movement was about, what it meant to her when she was creating it, her feelings as the Me Too movement exploded onto the scene and all of these Hollywood celebrities were taking it and running with it. This book is not as focused on her story of sexual assault and more focused on what Me Too meant, what her life was at the point that Me Too exploded onto the scene, and how she came to terms with Me Too being used on such a wide scale. I thought that this was a really interesting book. I thought that this did a good job of speaking to specifically how women of color are even more likely to not be believed when they're dealing with sexual assault. I like that her movement was focused on empowering and giving voices to women of color, and I like how she talks about what it meant when white women started using Me Too as their own. This book isn't as long as the other two, but it is brilliantly written and absolutely a worthwhile memoir to read. If you're interested in social justice, if you're interested in the issues of sexual assault, if you're in particular interested in how sexual assault can affect communities of color, I absolutely suggest that you read this book. And my final of the 5-star reads is not any lighter than any of the other books, and that is Between Two Kingdoms, a memoir of a life interrupted by Soulieka Jaouad. And this is a brutal book. This is Soulieka's story of how when she was 22, she was diagnosed with a rare and very aggressive form of leukemia. She goes through years of radiation and chemotherapy and experimental treatments, and it talks about what life is like with chronic illness, what life is like when you're not sure if you're going to live, the impact that has on all of the people around you. And then if you happen to make it through by some miracle, what life is like after. With the things that I've been going through with my own health lately, I have surgery coming up and I've been facing a lot of medical issues. This was a book that was really hard to read, but also really cathartic. I found myself reading this going, oh my gosh, she gets it. She gets it. There were things in here that made me feel so seen. And what I'm going through isn't fatal. It's not something that will kill me. it is something that continues to impact my life on a day-to-day basis, but there's hopefully a resolution. And I just felt so much empathy for what Soulieka describes, what she's been through. Just everything about this book really illustrates what living with a long-term illness or a long-term condition is like. The grief, the rage, the anger, the bargaining, the frustration when people don't understand, when the people around you are trying their best to help you and they just don't know how to get it right. Not because they don't care, but just because you can't possibly understand if you've never dealt with a chronic illness yourself. This book was everything that it should be. I don't have words for it. It's one of those books, again, where I know that sometimes a book touches you in a really personal way, and this one very much did that for me. It touched me in a very deep way. If you want to understand more about chronic illness and the journey to recovery after a chronic illness, you absolutely should read this. And I would say that if you have a family member that is suffering from chronic illness and you want to better understand their journey and maybe understand how to be a more empathetic family member, partner, what have you, pick up this book, because this book will make you understand some things that I don't know that, the person in your life would be able to articulately explain. So those are all of my reads for the month of April. As I mentioned, lots of really, really great reading. I am so happy with it. One of the things that I find really interesting when I reflect on my 5-star reads is how heavy they are thematically. We have a book about the Civil War in Sri Lanka. We have a book about a modern day Black woman being transported back to plantation and slavery. We have 3 books about sexual assault. We have a book about chronic debilitating illness, and we have a book about the conflict in Palestine. Definitely not the most cheerful reading, but I have to say that all of those books made me feel some very deep, poignant things. And if you're into feeling deep things as well, you like thematically rich books, I think any one of these 5-star reads would be worth your time. So that being said, my average rating for the month was a 3.94, which is really good for me. Usually I average between like 3.78 and 3.84, so a 3.94 is a little bit higher than average. My least favorite book of the month was The Bone Clocks by David Mitchell. This was just kind of dull and dry. There were a lot of pointless sections in this book. The parts that were interesting were too short and too spread out. And I would maybe give David Mitchell another chance, only because Jaimee tells me he's a much better writer than this particular book, but I definitely cannot recommend this one. My favorite book of the month was Between Two Kingdoms by Soulieka Jaouad, but honestly, it was a tough competition. Any one of my 5-star reads is like amazing. You should consider reading any of them. I think the only reason that this one was my favorite is just because I personally related to this on a very deep level. I also really related to Unbound, Know My Name, and Tell Me Everything, but I think that this one just hit a nerve. And I found myself tearing up while I was reading it. I found myself telling like my partner and my family members about things that I read in this book that I was like, look, she gets it, she understands. And I don't think that I always feel so deeply entrenched in a story. So for me, that's why this one is my favorite this month. But again, every single 5-star is fantastic. And on any given month, had I read any of these books in a different month, they would have easily been the favorite. So again, April was a fantastic month. I don't know how I'm gonna top it in May. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope that you enjoyed these reviews. I hope that you have found some new books to add to your TBR. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up, comment down below. Let me know all about your April reading. How was it? How many books did you read? What was your favorite? What was your least favorite? Anything that you would recommend that I pick up. And also let me know how you felt about the books that I reviewed. Do you disagree with any of my feelings on these books? Do you agree with any of them? Just tell me all of the things in the comments. Honestly, I just want to chat about books. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell, so that you never miss a video, and that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.